If there is anything people like to wax eloquently about today, it is the concept of the common man. Politicians will trip over themselves to relate to the common man, often posting incredibly cringe-inducing pictures of themselves doing things the common man does. Senator Chuck Schumer recently showed a picture of himself grilling hamburgers and hot dogs on his porch, and he had placed cheese on a raw hamburger patty to show that he was in touch with the common man. I use that example to illustrate what happens when they try these things. The attempt to connect with the common man usually just turns the politician into the object of laughter. But we live in a time where the common man is the target of oppression by those who will often wax eloquently about freedom and democracy and the rest. It's an interesting subject with deep implications for the Catholic. And today I have for you the writings of GK Chesterton on the oppression of the common man and what it means for a Catholic in particular. The Persecution of the Common Man by GK Chesterton. The explanation, or excuse for this essay is to be found in a certain notion, which seems to me very obvious, but which I have never, as it happens, seen stated by anybody else. It happens rather to cut across the common frontiers of current controversy. It can be used for or against democracy, according to whether that swear word is or is not printed with a big D. It can be connected, like most things, with religion, but only rather indirectly, with my own religion. It is primarily the recognition of a fact, quite apart from the approval or disapproval of the fact. But it does involve the assertion that what has really happened in the modern world is practically the precise contrary of what is supposed to have happened there. The thesis is this, that modern emancipation has really been a new persecution of the common man. If it has emancipated anybody, it has in rather special and narrow ways emancipated the uncommon man. It has given an eccentric sort of liberty to some of the hobbies of the wealthy, and occasionally to some of the more humane lunacies of the cultured. The only thing it has forbidden is common sense, as it would have been understood by the common people. Thus, if we begin with the 17th and 18th centuries, we find that a man really has become more free to found a secretive group. But the common man does not in the least want to found such. He is much more likely, for instance, to want to found a family, and it is exactly there that the modern emancipators are quite likely to begin to frustrate him, in the name of the Malthusianism or of the controlling people or at more advanced stage of progress, probably the ending of the most vulnerable. It would be a model of modern liberty to tell him that he might preach anything, however wild, about the virgin birth, so long as he avoided anything like a natural birth, and that he was welcome to build a tin chapel to preach a two-penny creed entirely based on the text, Enoch begat Methuselah, so long as he himself is forbidden to beget anybody. And as a matter of historical fact, the groups which enjoyed this sectarian freedom in the 17th or 18th centuries were generally founded by merchants or manufacturers of the comfortable, and sometimes of the luxurious classes. On the other hand, it is strictly to the lower classes, to use the liberal modern title for the poor, that such schemes as preventing them from begetting anybody are commonly directed and applied. It is the same when we pass from the Protestant world of the 17th and 18th centuries to the progressive world of the 19th and 20th. Here, the form of freedom mostly claimed, as a boast and a dogma, is the freedom of the press. It is no longer merely a freedom of pamphlets, but a freedom of papers, or rather, it is less and less a freedom at all, and more a monopoly. But the important point is that the process, the test, and the comparison are the same as in the first example. Modern emancipation means this, that anybody who can afford it can publish a newspaper, but the common man would not want to publish a newspaper even if he could afford it. He might want, for instance, to go on talking politics in a pothouse or the parlor of an inn, and that is exactly the sort of really popular talk about politics which modern movements have often abolished. The old democracies by forbidding the pothouse, the new dictatorships by forbidding the politics. Or again, it is the boast of recent emancipated ethics and politics not to put any great restraints upon anybody who wants to publish a book, especially a scientific book, full of psychology or sociology, or perhaps unavoidably full of perversions and polite, impure material. As that modern tendency increased, it was less and less likely that the police would interfere very much with a man publishing the sort of book that only the wealthy could publish with sumptuous artistic plates or scientific diagrams. It is much more probable in most modern societies that the police would be found interfering with a man singing a song, of a coarse and candid description, bawling out a ballad of the grosser sort, or even using the more restrained medium of prose with a similar lack of restraint. Yet there is a great deal to be said for song, or even speech, of the old ribald sort, as compared with writing of the new sort, which, when it is at once analytic and anarchic. The old obscenity had a gusto and a great virility even in its violence, which is not easily rendered in a diagram or table of statistics, and the old was always normal and never had any of the horrors of abnormality. The point is that here again the common man does not generally want to write a book, whereas he may occasionally want to sing a song. He certainly does not want to write a book on psychology or sociology, or to read it, but he does want to talk, to sing, to shout, to yell and howl on due and suitable occasions. Rightly or wrongly, it is when he is thus engaged that he is much more likely to fall foul of a policeman than when he is, or as he never is, writing a scientific study on a new theory of the marital act. The upshot of uplift in the modern sense is the same in practice as in the previous examples. In the actual atmosphere of the age, men will still be arrested for using a certain kind of language, long after they cannot be arrested for writing a certain kind of literature. It would be easy to give other examples, but these contemporary examples are already too continuous to be a coincidence. It is equally true, for instance, that the liberating movement of the 18th century, the life in the American and French revolutions, while it did really vindicate many virtues of republican simplicity and civic liberty, also accepted as virtues several things that were obviously vices, that had been recognized as vices long before, and now are again beginning to be recognized as vices long so afterwards. Where even ambition had once been a pardonable vice, avarice became an utterly unpardonable virtue. Liberal economics too often meant merely giving to those already rich the liberty to grow richer, and magnificently granting to the poor the permission to remain rather poorer than before. It was much more certain that the usurer was released to practice usury than the peasant was released from the practices of the usurer. It was much more certain that the wheat pit was as big as the bottomless pit than the man who grew wheat would ever be found anywhere except at the bottom. There was a sense in which liberal economics were a proclamation of freedom, for the few who were rich enough to be free. Nobody thought there was anything strange about talking of prominent public men gambling in the wheat pit. But at this time, there were laws of all kinds against normal human gambling, that is, against games of chance. The poor man was prevented from gambling precisely because he did not gamble so much as the rich man. The beadle of the policeman might stop children from playing chuck farthing, but it was strictly because it was only a farthing that was chucked. Progress never interfered with the game of chuck fortune, because much more than a farthing was being chucked. The enlightened and emancipated age especially encouraged those who chucked away other people's fortunes instead of their own. But anyhow, the comparison remains continuous and clear. Progress, in the sense of the progress that has progressed since the 16th century, has upon every matter persecuted the common man, punished the gambling he enjoys and permitted the gambling he cannot follow, restrained the obscenity that might amuse him, and applauded the obscenity that would certainly bore him, silenced the political quarrels that can be conducted among men, and applauded the political stunts and syndicates that can only be conducted by millionaires, encouraged anybody who had anything to say about God, if it was said with a priggish and supercilious accent, but discouraged anybody who had anything to say in favor of man, and his common relations to manhood and motherhood, and the normal appetites of nature. Progress has been merely the persecution of the common man. Progress has a hagiology, a martyrology, a mass of miraculous legends of its own, like any other religion, and they are mostly false and belong to a false religion. The most famous is the fancy that the young and progressive person is always martyred by the old and ordinary person. But it is false. It is the old and ordinary person who is almost always the martyr. It is the old and ordinary person who has been more and more despoiled of his old and ordinary rights. Insofar as this progress progresses, it is more likely that 6 million men will be forbidden to go to sleep, because 6 men say certain breathing exercises are a substitute for slumber, than that of the any 6 million somnambulists who will wake up sufficiently to clout the 6 men over the high-browed but half-witted heads. There is no normal thing that cannot now be taken from the normal man. It is much more likely that a law will be passed to forbid the eating of grain, notoriously the parent of toxics like beer and whiskey, than that it will ever be faintly suggested, to men of that philosophy, that the economic evil is that men cannot grow grain, and that the ethical evil is that men are still despised for growing it. Given the purely progressive principle and nothing else as a guide to our future, it is entirely possible that they may be ended for growing it. But of course, in a scientific age, they will be electrocuted, or perhaps only afflicted by electricity. Thus far, my thesis is this: that it is not the uncommon man who is persecuted, but rather the common man. But this brings me into direct conflict with the contemporary reaction, which seems to say in effect that the common man had much better be persecuted. It is quite certain that many modern thinkers and writers honestly feel contempt for the common man. It is also quite certain that I myself feel a contempt for those who feel this contempt. But the actual issue must be faced more fully, because what is called the reaction against democracy is at this moment the chief result of democracy. Now, in this quarrel, I am democratic, or at least defiant of the attacks of democracy. I do not believe that most modern people have seen the real point of the advantage or disadvantage of popular rule. And my doubt can be largely suggested and summarized under this title of the common man. To put it briefly, it is now the custom to say that most modern blunders have been due to the common man. And I should like to point out what appalling blunders have in fact been due to the uncommon man. It is easy enough to argue that the crowd makes mistakes, but as a fact, it never has a chance to even make mistakes until its superiors have used their superiority to make much worse mistakes. It is easy to weary of democracy and cry out for an intellectual aristocracy, but the trouble is that every intellectual aristocracy seems to have been utterly unintellectual. Anybody might guess beforehand that there would be blunders of the ignorant. What nobody could have guessed, what nobody could have dreamed of in a nightmare, what no morbid mortal imagination could ever dared to imagine, was the mistake of the well-informed. It is true in a sense to say that the group has always been led by more educated men. It is much more true in a sense to say that it has always been misled by educated men. It is enough to say that the cultured man should be the crowd's guide, philosopher, and friend. Unfortunately, he has nearly always been a misguided guide, a false friend, and a very shallow philosopher. And the actual catastrophes we have suffered, including those we are now suffering, have not in historical fact been due to the prosaic practical people who are supposed to know nothing, but almost invariably to the highly theoretical people who knew that they knew everything. The world may learn by its mistakes, but they are mostly the mistakes of the learned. To go back no further than the 17th century, the quarrel between the Puritans and the populace was originally due to the pride of a few men in being able to read a printed book, and their scorn for people who had good memories, good traditions, good stories, good songs, and good pictures in glass or gold or graven stone, and therefore had less need of books. It was a tyranny of literates over illiterates, but it was the literates who were narrow, sullen, limited, and often oppressive. It was the illiterates who were at least relatively happy and free and fanciful and imaginative and interested in everything. The uncommon man, the elect of the Calvinist theory, did undoubtedly lead the people along the next stretch of the path of progress. But what it led to was a prison. The book-reading rulers and statesmen managed to establish the Scottish Sabbath. Meanwhile, 1,000 traditions of the sort they would have trampled out, yet managed to trickle down from the medieval poor to the modern poor, and lingering as legends in countless cottages and farmhouses, were collected by Scott, often repeated orally by people who could not read or write, to combine in the construction of the great Scottish romances, which profoundly moved and partly inspired the Romantic movement throughout the world. When we pass to the 18th century, we find the same part played by a new and quite contrary party, different from the last in everything except in being the same sort of rather dried-up aristocracy. The new uncommon man, now leading the people, are no longer Calvinists, but a dry sort of deists, drying up more and more like atheists. And they are no longer pessimists, but the reverse. Only their optimism is often more depressing than pessimism. They are the Benthamites, the utilitarians, the servants of the economic man, the first free traders. They have the credit of having first made clear the economic theories of the modern state, and the calculations on which were mainly based the politics of the 19th century. It was they who taught these things scientifically and systematically to the public, and even to the populace. But what were the things and what were the theories? Perhaps the best and broadest of them was a most monstrous and mythical superstition of Adam Smith, a theological theory that Providence had so made the world that men might be happy through their selfishness, or in other words, that God would overrule everything for good, if only men could succeed in being sufficiently bad. The intellectuals in this epoch taught definitely and dogmatically that if only men could buy and sell freely, lend or borrow freely, sweat or sack freely, and in practice steal or swindle freely, humanity would be happy. The common man soon found out how happy, in the slums where they left him, and in the slump to which they led him. We need not continue through the last 2 centuries all the tale of the frenzy and folly inflicted by the fickleness of the educated classes on the relatively stability of the uneducated. The fickle intellectuals next rushed to other extremes and became socialists, despising small property as they had despised popular tradition. It is quite true that these intellectuals had a lucid interval in which they proclaimed some primary truth, along with many priggish falsehoods. Some of them did rightly exalt liberty and human dignity and equality, as expressed in the Declaration of Independence, but even that was so much mishandled that there is now a disposition to deny the truth along with the falsehood. There's been a reaction against democracy, or in plain words, the prigs are now too bored even to go on with their normal routine about the common man, the familiar routine of oppressing him in practice and adoring him in theory. I do not adore him, but I do believe in him. At least I believe in him much more than I believe in them. I think the actual history of the relations between him and them, as I have narrated it, is enough to justify my preference. I repeat that they have had all the educational advantages over him. They have always led him. They have always misled him. And even in becoming reactionaries, they remain as raw and crude as when they were revolutionaries. Their anti-democracy is as much stuffed with cant as their democracy. I need only allude to the detestable new fashion of referring to ordinary men as morons. First, it is pedantry, the dullest form of vanity, for a moron is only the Greek for a fool, and it is mostly sham pedantry, for most of those who mention morons hardly know they are talking Greek, still less why on earth they should. It also involves this moral evil, that a man who says that men are mostly fools knows at least that he has often made a fool of himself, whereas the morons are thought of like monkeys, as if they were a fixed tribe or caste. The common man may well be the victim of a new series of tyrannies, founded on the scientific fad of regarding him as a monkey, but it is doubtful whether he can be much more persecuted for having the instincts of a moron than he has already had for having the instincts of a man. We live in political times, what can be said, right? And this time now where that begins to feel like the common man is revolting against those who try to pander to the common man. It makes these kind of subjects, I think, interesting to reflect on. As Catholics, we have a bit of a duty to be more of an uncommon man, not the way that Chesterton used it here, to be uncommon by doing things motivated by the faith, by living vibrantly with the faith. And how does that work when talking about the oppression of the common man? The easiest way to lift that oppression is not through some sort of extra legal methods, it's to do it by conversion of the culture to the faith. And it's the easiest way, but it's also the hardest way, because it requires us to stand up and defend the faith in the public square. I'm curious though what you think about this. What are your thoughts on this piece that you heard from Chesterton? Let me know in the comments, please. It's one of those forgotten essays of his that I think is particularly timely now. But let me know what you think of this in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. So to sharing this on social media, that helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.